Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 20th episode of Unboxing AI. A different face here with all of you today. I'm Dhruv Sahai. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at CARPL. I look after the legal, regulatory, finance, admin, HR, IT, and AI onboarding verticals here at CARPL. Not too many. And CARPL is the world's largest radiology AI marketplace with the only FDA cleared viewer. And talking about FDA brings me to our guest for today, who's somewhat of a legend in the regulatory space, Dr. Hugh Harvey from Hardian Health. So, welcome, Dr. Hugh, and it's a pleasure to have you with us at our Unboxing AI webinar. And why don't you tell everyone about yourself?
Thanks, Drew. Thanks to you and your team for inviting me onto this webinar session. About me, I'm Hugh. I live in the UK. I trained as a radiologist here, and I became a consultant, which is the equivalent of an attending radiologist in the States. I also did a postgraduate degree, computer vision techniques in MRI, specifically looking at prostate cancer. And I've worked in a couple of health tech startups. After my clinical training, my degree, my research degree, I went to go and work for a very small company called Babylon Health, which became the biggest UK health tech unicorn, and then the biggest health tech unicorn implosion in a very short space of time. I also, for a period of time, was clinical director at Medical, which is one of the radiology AI companies. They've got algorithm for breast mammography undergoing clinical trials in the UK. Based on all of those experiences, so being a clinician, an academic, and having worked a bit in industry, I decided one day to become an advisor to companies and set up my business called Hardian. And that was 6 years ago. And now, by complete sheer accident and luck, now have a team of about 20 people and clients around the world, and have kind of become a regulatory expert for all things health tech, and not just limited to radiology AI. I'm very lucky, I think. I found what the Japanese call ikigai, which is a central core meaning to what you want to do. My work-life balance and the things that I do, I love it and I enjoy it. I hope that comes across when I engage with the community in this kind of stuff. It's a pleasure to be at the cutting edge of technology in medicine. And it's a pleasure to be able to use a skill set that's been acquired through clinical training, through academic training, working in industry, to apply that to getting really exciting cutting edge tools into the market by showing that they're safe, effective, cyber secure, unbiased. Hopefully.
Sorry to interrupt you. I don't think the audience can hear you very clearly. There is your voice is coming across very softly.
Is it? I apologize for that. We'll
Now,
try and get a bit closer
now
and talk
that's the you we know.
loud.
Now we can hear you loud and clear. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I lost my thread, but yeah, pleasure to be here. I hope that explains a little bit about me, and I'm happy to be here this afternoon.
Great. So, I mean, before we discuss more specific questions or pick up a topic to talk about, and audience also feel free to ask questions, in the chat box, and we'll try and answer as many as we can in the time that we have. But you, interestingly, what I would like to know more about is how you made the switch from clinical to regulatory, and what excites you about regulatory. How is regulatory the caffeine in your life?
How did I make the switch? So the switch happened, I think, in two stages. So first of all, the switch out of clinical. When I was a consultant, I working in a hospital, I was just doing what radiologists do. I was sitting there reading scans and interacting with colleagues and clinicians and patients. And I just felt like I had something else that I needed to be doing. And I was thinking about trying to find a job outside of medicine in health tech. And at the time, Babylon Health was hiring, and I applied, and they initially rejected me, and then I was persistent and eventually got an interview and got in. So that was kind of my switch out of medicine into industry. But it wasn't until one day, completely by chance, the UK regulators, the MHRA, knocked on the door at the offices at Babylon Health. We were building an AI chatbot back in the time, and they knocked on the door and they said, "Can we speak to your head of regulatory?" Of course, we didn't have a head of regulatory. No one had heard about medical device regulation, and the CEO just said, "Oh yes, of course, come and meet Dr. Harvey. He's our head of regulatory." And so there I was. So I was kind of like completely forced into it. I had a few meetings with these people from the MHRA who were very nice, but explained under no uncertain terms that they considered an AI chatbot to be a medical device, quite rightly. And so I had to quickly go on a crash course. And for the sort of next 6 to 9 months, I dove into reading the regulations, which are, I'm sure not many people have actually read from start to finish, let alone built a technical file on their own from scratch. But we managed to get a class 1 medical device registration, which was allowed at the time under the current regulations at the time. So it was technically the first regulatory registered AI chatbot in the world. So I felt like we'd made some progress and broken some ground there. And then I was involved in some part at Chiron in getting a class 2 regulatory approval for a radiology AI deep learning system for mammography. And that was the first in Europe at the time, I believe. So again, it felt like breaking new ground. And then since then, I've been helping others. And of course, my regulatory knowledge is deep, but it's not particularly technical. So I hired people who are on the technical side to help work with Hardian. So we have quality assurance people, we have people who are specialists in quality management systems, we have ex ISO auditors on the team. So we can now cover that kind of. But what I love about regulatory is that it's a mixture of 3 things. I think the first is that it's highly clinical. Like the reason that regulations exist is to ensure that devices are safe for patients and that they actually are conformant to a clinical standard. And that sort of tickles my box of doing the right thing for the patient. It chimes with my background as a clinician. The second thing is it's technical. It's a complex problem, and I quite like these challenges. The third thing is that it's meaningful. Without regulatory approval, you can't sell or distribute a medical device, and so it has a huge impact to companies. And so I think it's for me, it's something that's complex, it's clinical, and it's impactful, and that's why I enjoy it so much. The regulation is only the start of getting things to market. It's the kind of the minimum barrier. You can't get to market without it. What I'm also interested in is proper clinical trial designs. I've been involved in a lot of clinical trial designs and writing up the results. I still try and publish academically when the opportunities arise. I'm also really interested in the return on investment of technology in medicine. So the concept of health economic modeling is really interesting as well. So how do you actually mathematically prove that there is a return on investment based on the improvement of outcomes or the efficiencies that can be generated? And then another factor that I'm interested in more and more is the intellectual property around these things. It's a complex space, the IP world. We've got an excellent patent attorney on our team who does help explain things very clearly. And so we've been involved in making sure that people are not only are they protected in terms of their intellectual property, but they're not infringing that of others, which I think is a crucial thing to have a thriving market. So those are the things that really interest me and drive me. And I would recommend that anybody who's got any kind of vague interest in regulatory, just if they want to get started, just read the regulations. They are there. They are a bit dry, to say the least, but they are there. And start thinking about how you would apply them to your project. And you might be interested in developing something, or you might be interested as a clinician or a hospital manager in how you can instill best regulatory practice into your services to deliver these technologies to your patients. So I'm hoping that this webinar in some way can inspire people to get a bit more interested in this aspect, which I find absolutely fascinating.
And if you don't get inspired by Hugh, I don't know who you get inspired by, because it's been an amazing journey. And I have had the opportunity to know Hugh now personally as well. And it's inspiring what you've done in the regulatory field. And yeah, there's never a dull day in regulatory. Every day is a new day. So I mean, we are you know we are in a webinar which is called Unboxing AI. So we should talk about AI. And what I want to specifically also discuss with you, get to know from you, is what is your take on regulatory in AI? I mean, both jurisdictionally, and how are regulations supporting innovations, and how are they making room to support innovations, given that they are a validation, process, right? So how does that work?
Yeah, and it works differently around the world. So there are two major regulatory jurisdictions that everyone considers. One is the European Union, and the other is America, so the FDA. There is in the background a lesser known organization that's very powerful in regulatory called the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And the FDA and Europeans and other countries are all members of this consortium called the IMDRF. And they are there to try and figure out, like, how can we make sure that regulations globally are aligned so that there's not too much of a difference between trying to get a regulatory clearance in one jurisdiction than another. But that said, there are still differences that remain, and they're largely due down to sort of the political nature of the jurisdictions. America has a slightly different approach to regulation than, say, Europe, but they still, to an essence, rely on the same international standards. So it's interesting to kind of see the interplay between the two. And I think the first thing to remember when we're talking about any regulatory jurisdiction is that regulations are not there to stop you getting to market. They are there to enable you to get to market with a safe and effective product. And if your product is not safe and effective, I think we can all agree it shouldn't be on market, right? And that's all the regulations are there for. And how do you prove it is safe and effective? It's actually relatively straightforward. You decide what you want to claim your thing does, and you figure out what is known as state of the art. State of the art is not the latest paper on archive. The state of the art is what is currently done in healthcare. So, for example, if it's a radiology AI, what is currently done in radiology to find lung nodules on the chest X-ray? It's a radiologist reading a chest X-ray, finding a lung nodule, writing a report. That is known as state of the art. You figure out how accurate are radiologists at doing that, and then that is your benchmark if you want to claim that you can do that. And then you set up a study to show that your device demonstrably, repeatedly, and robustly can do that to that benchmark of performance. And then you submit that documentation to the regulators, and they look at that, and they decide whether or not you have met the standards and proven your claim with some scientific evidence. So that framework is the same in America and in Europe. Underpinning that is what's known as quality management. So it's not just about generating the clinical evidence, it's about showing that your company, not just your device, your company has a culture of quality management, so that you are effectively telling the regulators and showing them your processes of how you ensure that every single product that you're releasing meets a certain level of quality. And quality management systems are kind of like this ethereal, mysterious entity, but to most people, but really they're very simple at their core. What they are is you writing down your processes. So it's not just a bunch of engineers deciding what to put in which sprint. It's having a step back and having processes for accountability and responsibility for all the decisions that are made. And so it's documented. And the way I like to think of it is a quality management system, in essence, is your fail-safe in your business. If all of your team got hit by a bus tomorrow, if you had a proper quality management system fully documented, you could hire another team who could simply take over, because everything would have been written down and documented, and your product could still be produced to the same standard. That's how drugs work. That's how drug manufacturers produce the same drug worldwide. They have quality management standards. So it's exactly the same thing for software and AI in principle. What's interesting about AI is it's so much more complicated than previous medical devices. It's more complicated than a hip prosthesis. It's more complicated than a contact lens, because there are so many components and moving parts. And this is where you get to stretch the regulatory paradigm a little with these AI systems. And I think the FDA in particular are more forward thinking than the European Union, maybe because they've got sort of single jurisdiction responsibility. They've got that flexibility, whereas Europe has to consider 28 member states. And so, yeah, really interesting to see like new regulatory shifts happening slowly, but they are happening. And I love sort of having a finger on the pulse of that cutting edge and seeing what those regulatory shifts might be.
Interesting, Luke. That's quite insightful. I have a question from Dr. Kotler, who's the associate CMO at Rat Partners, and she asks, I mean, do you feel that with the US FDA, the regulatory process, which is so comprehensive, does it, put the US market behind in terms of AI deployment versus other countries? And she also asks, I mean, foundational models, which are, more generic models, what, how will they get through the regulatory process in different countries?
Fine, two different questions there. We'll start with the first one, the FDA. The FDA definitely has pros and cons to its system. So to the audience who don't know some of the nuances, the FDA has essentially 4 routes by which you can get to market. The 2 most common routes are what's known as a pre-market authorization or a 510K. There's also the de novo route for very new devices. But there's an exemption route, which is the 4th route. But if you are a medical device, essentially you choose between a PMA or a 510K. We don't have that in Europe, so this is like an interesting function that the FDA have developed over time. A PMA is essentially what the Europeans do for every single device. You fill out a full technical file with full clinical evidence for your device, and you're basing your submission on your device alone. What a 510K is when you say, well, actually, we don't need to do a really deep dive full submission because we're kind of similar to a device that's already approved on market. It's already safe and effective, but our device doesn't demonstrate any new safety concerns, and the performance is just as good. And so you submit slightly more abbreviated sets of documentation. It doesn't mean you submit zero evidence, as some people erroneously believe. It means that you submit perhaps just some retrospective data, maybe a mixed reader, mixed case study of submission of your device, as well as some of your cybersecurity documentation, and you have a quality management system, and you submit that to get your 510K, and then you get cleared based on your equivalence to a predicate device on the market. Now that is what speeds up devices to market in America, and it's why we see well over 700, I think 800 now, AI devices cleared in America, but we have far fewer cleared in Europe, because we don't have that equivalence pathway. Actually, that's not 100% true. We do have the equivalence pathway, but the only way to prove it in Europe is to actually have direct access and a contractual agreement with the predicate to have access to their data, which I think in America, probably wouldn't see that happening, because that would be seen as giving away your intellectual property to your direct competitors. So I've not seen that pathway used in Europe, but it is possible. So that's the kind of the difference between FDA and Europe, is that you have that 510K pathway. But there are also sort of cons to the 510K pathway. I think, first of all, while it is a good way to allow sort of early innovations that are roughly equivalent onto market. There are doubts and concerns that is it actually robust enough for the field of AI? Because really, if you take it down to its most logical foundations, can two AI models actually be substantially equivalent? Because they're not trained on the same data. They weren't given the same ground truth. They weren't validated in the same way. They might not even have the same intended purpose. They might be looking for the same thing on an X-ray, yet they can be named substantially equivalent. And that for me has always sat a little bit uncomfortably. And we're starting now to see in the academic literature coming out of America a slight lack of distrust of 510K cleared AI products. There's a lot of American clinicians and academics saying, well, it says it's FDA cleared, but I'm still going to test it myself. I'm still going to put it through because I want to see proof and the data. And so it's kind of backing up that theory that maybe the 510K system really isn't quite enough for pure AI devices, because these things are slightly more black box than previous medical devices or even indeed drugs were. But of course, the pro is that it's a slightly faster and technically slightly easier route than a CE mark. So that's to answer the first part. The second part of the question, you're going to have to remind me, was about foundation models in radiology?
It was about foundational models. I mean, foundational models, generic models, and how would they get through regulatory processes in different countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating technology. The whole world has been enamored with ChatGPT and the like for the past couple of years now. But none, to my knowledge, made it into regulatory approval. There are no certified large language model based medical devices or large vision model based medical devices that I know of. Wide. Happy to be corrected if someone knows of one, but I'm not aware of any. And I think the reason for that is that unlike linear regression or a deep learning neural network, these large language models are predictive. And what I mean by that is that they don't necessarily operate in a deterministic manner. So you can give them an input and the output can be different every time you give the same input. What they also suffer from, famously, is hallucinations, which are a byproduct of the way that those models are built. They are foundational to the models, in that they are predictive models, and sometimes the prediction is wrong. And so in that sense, it's difficult to see them becoming clinical grade, because anyone who's used a piece of software in a hospital is not going to accept, I don't think, a software system where the outputs change depending on the time of day, and B, are sometimes randomly incorrect. It doesn't feel safe. They might well be very plausible sounding, and the text might look, good enough, but good enough isn't good enough. I don't think in medicine it has to be better than that. And it's actually very difficult to clinically evaluate the outputs of these devices because of that huge variation. And people have come up with and proposed all sorts of metrics of how we can measure factual accuracy and bias and the determinism of these models. But I've not yet seen the regulators approve anything. That said, I'm aware the FDA in its research division is undertaking a couple of projects involving large language models to try and figure out how might someone prove safety and effectiveness of these technologies. When it comes to large vision models, this is a sort of newer version. I guess it's a more compute intensive multimodal version of large language models, where the input might be an X-ray and the output might be a fully generated report. These are showing promise, though they're not as accurate as typical deep learning based models. There may be routes to getting them regulatory cleared if they can be very sort of guardrailed and limited in their functionalities. where we can show that there is a robust and repeatable deterministic outcome. But unless it is deterministic and repeatable, it's going to be very difficult to get that through regulatory barriers.
Interestingly, you mentioned Chat GPT, and I couldn't help but think. Only today I asked Chat GPT a question: how many R's in strawberry? And it said two. And I was
Yeah,
like, there we go. That's how reliable this was.
exactly.
So I know we are running short of time, and I want to take some questions from the audience. And there's an interesting question by Chris McKee, who actually talks about the AI Act, which we didn't actually touch upon, and it's a big deal now. The AI Act, which has come out in the EU, and he says whilst this aligns to what we say, I mean, it adds a significant amount of regulatory complexity, which can increase costs, and he feels this could be an innovation blocker and not a supporter. And I mean, his question is, how do we balance the benefits of this with the issues? I guess the issue being how comprehensive they are, and how time consuming they are and expensive they are.
Yeah, so the EU Act is the largest piece of legislation that the European Commission has ever produced. It's massive, but it doesn't just cover medical devices, it covers AI for every single sector. Actually, when you drill down and actually look like what is the burden on medical device developers using AI, there isn't that much additional. Your quality management system has to include certain things that the AI Act mandates, but by and large, you still need to go out and get your CE mark. And the notified bodies, who are the people who do the auditing here in Europe, they are all preparing to do your AI Act audit at the same time as your CE marking audit. And the documentation burden actually isn't that significantly great. So if you already have a quality management system, you only have to add in a couple of processes to be compliant with ISO 42001, for instance. And there's a couple other general safety performance requirements that might need to be tweaked. But I wouldn't say it's by any means, a significant increase in the amount of documentation that is required. I think it's more enhancing what the medical device regulations, the MDR, already say, especially in terms of post-market surveillance. That's really where the shift in regulatory focus is going these days. Is okay, pre-market, we can do a single study at a point in time and show that it was safe then. But post-market is kind of how you show ongoing safety and performance, which I think everyone agrees really in this sector that's the real way to truly learn to trust and use these systems appropriately. So the AI Act has a bit more of a focus on that post-market surveillance, basically beefs up what the MDR already says.
No, and talking about post market, I think we have just enough time for one more question. And there was an interesting question asked by Dr. Arjun Balaji from Olympus Medical Systems in India. His question was, with model drifts, model changes, how can we regulate these models in a realistic, agile, and cost-effective manner?
Yeah, it is a challenge. So model drift and changes is something that's well documented and understood. And I think the way to do this is through post-market surveillance, really robust post-market surveillance, where you are at least doing sort of subsampling audits on a regular time period, or at least doing them every time an input parameter might change. So for instance, if a hospital upgrades their CT scanner software, you probably should be doing an audit on any AI algorithms reading those scans, because the performance could change. And we should be measuring those in real time, and we should be giving that data back to the vendors. And then on the vendor side, they should be considering the exciting new developments from the FDA, which is predetermined change control plans, known as PCCPs. So they should be able to discuss with the FDA a documented process within their quality management system of how they're going to update their algorithm based on new feedback and new data. And what that means is that if they have a solid PCCP agreed with the regulators, they will have a process by which they can ingest new data to retrain or fine-tune their algorithm, and then release an update without having to go through a whole new 510K, which is currently what you have to do. You do a special 510K to update your algorithm. You won't have to do that if you have PCCP agreed with the regulator. So I think to address the question directly on bias and drift, it's going to be a combination of more robust post-market surveillance and proactive predetermined change control plans within a quality management system, and really good communication between the hospital using the software, feeding back that data to the vendor, who can then use that data to improve.
I know we have completed our 30 minutes, but I just came across a very interesting question and I have to ask this.
Sure.
So Angel from Quivim asks this question: does regulation need to be oriented to ask for maximum explainability or maximum performance and stability?
Hmm. It's a good question. The truth is, you only have to prove what you're claiming. So if you're claiming maximum accuracy, then you have to prove it. If you're claiming maximum explainability, then you have to prove it. And it will depend on the use case. Some use cases will never be 100% accurate. So you have to figure out what is the state of the art human performance, and can we enhance that with our algorithm. On the explainability side, you only have to be as explainable as the user requires it to be. So for instance, if you have something that is finding lung nodules, all you have to do is show a bounding box around the lung nodule. I don't think you have to explain why you think that is a lung nodule. I think it's kind of implicit in the fact that you have a bounding box around it that shows that the system thinks it is a lung nodule. So I don't think you have to engineer towards maximum explainability or performance directly. I think you have to tailor it to the claims that you want to make on market. And I think just before we finish, on that point, the most important thing I would say to anybody in this space is really focus on the intended use and the claims that you're making. Really avoid hype. Every claim you make, be able to prove it mathematically, scientifically, and you will be absolutely fine. The regulators cannot strike you off if you are within your claims with the evidence, and people will trust your device as well. Don't overblow your claims. I know it's super tempting. It's super tempting. I get that, but don't do it, because you'd only land yourself in hot water.
Oh, absolutely, and I'm 100% in agreement with that. That brings us to the close of an amazing and insightful session. And thank you, Hugh. It's been great. Also, for the questions we have not been able to answer, we will answer them. You can check out our LinkedIn page on Unboxing AI, where you'll find the answers. And join us for our next webinar next Friday, our 21st episode at 11 a.m. ET. And the registration link has been shared on the chat box. Right, Hugh, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to more, chats with you. They're always a great learning.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise, take care. Bye bye.